Good morning. How are you guys? It's 8:30 and we're going to start on time because we have a lot of really good material to get through that I don't want to rush it. So we're going to start on time today. My name is Jessica. I'm the moderator today, and when I was considering the different presentations that are happening today, I think a really common and encouraging theme between all three of these is this progression from an approach of stream restoration that really focuses on kind of controlling a natural system, and now we're moving towards approaches that really work with a natural system, and that can be kind of an unknown and scary thing sometimes. So thank you all for for taking that leap, and I think we're going to see some really good progress in the future. It feels like we're on a good pace. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Travis Stroth is a river restoration engineer with a depth of expertise in applying geomorphic and sediment transport analysis in combination with hydraulic analysis to expand lines of scientific evidence that improve river system understanding. Travis? Oh, and we're also going to do questions after each session, so keep your questions for right afterwards.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay, that's what I need. I got terrible sleep last night, so I'm a little down on energy, so there we go. That's exactly what I need. Okay. So islands in the stream, as the theme song implies, we think might be a missing river restoration opportunity, particularly here in Colorado, right? So, islands in the stream, right? So unfortunately, we're not talking about beaches, and we're not talking about this song with Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, but I did want to share one of the quotes from the song here. So islands in the stream, that is what we are. No one in between. How can we be wrong, right? So hopefully we all agree on that by the end of the presentation. Okay, so for some of y'all that saw our pre-conference workshop, there will be some overlap in slides, but I guess that's how it goes. Sometimes overlap is not the worst thing, I guess. So this, now looking at islands, what we're actually talking about is bars in rivers, right? So these are, for those familiar, this is from River Styles. This is just some pictures of types of bars in rivers. And over on the, highlighted in red, over on this side of the screen, these are sort of focused on the single thread channel bars. The most common bars everybody's used to seeing, like point bars and lateral bars that are basically the same thing as a point bar, just in different formats and attached to the bank, right? But over here we see what we can call a mid-channel bar, or islands. They have one specifically for an island, actually, but they're all sort of the same thing, just different configurations. But basically the point of this is to say there's actually a lot more variations of mid-channel bars. But particularly in Colorado restoration, we've seen a lot of focus, again, like we've talked about before, on sort of more single-thread channels, a little less complex. And we think there's a missing opportunity in restoration to use these more mid-channel features, engage flow and kickstart processes. And just to say, of course, and I think the plenaries yesterday helped to remind us that in the Northwest, a lot of these things are already more common in a lot of ways. But here in Colorado, we are catching up in certain ways, but we're also learning how to apply these things to Colorado specifically, right? Because we have different systems here than the Northwest. So we'll see examples, but there's things that are commonly used in the Northwest, such as called bar apex jams that are, I guess I got a pointer here, constructed log jams that create a hydraulic shadow behind them and a bar behind them can create good complexity. Okay, so now looking at a cross-sectional view of this to conceptualize this. So of course these islands are variable in space and time and stage dependent, right? So on the top here, basically this cross-section here is just generically representing a valley bottom channel. We have a main channel here, and we have one sort of overflow path or high flow path during higher flows. And at the three different flows here, we can generically say this is sort of like a base flow, and then sort of an intermediate flood flow or bankful flow, if you will, and then this is the extremely high, more 100-year flow event. So let's say the dashed section here is just pointing here to a more traditional single-thread point bar feature, and then a generic sort of mid-channel bar feature. And basically at low flow, right, the traditional point bar is a single thread channel at that flow, right? But as flow comes up to more medium flows and might engage an overflow path, it becomes actually a multi-thread channel at that flow, right? And then as it keeps going up to the 100-year and it's valley to valley bottom, it's single thread again, right? So it's just variable in space and time. And as we talked about, that diversity leads to a lot of diversity in habitat that's very useful in restoration. And in the case of the mid-channel bar, at low flow, the only difference is now it's multi-thread at low flow, in this case, with the height of this island. And as it goes up to medium flow, it's also split flow. It's actually single thread in the main channel, but it's multi-thread on between these two channels, and then single thread again. Right, so I think this seems very simplistic, but I think sometimes it's hard for people and people we've worked with to picture these type of things at sort of different time and space intervals and what it means, and just how you can apply these features based on that. So I'm going to have some fun and go into examples of, quote, natural rivers. For those of you that were in the pre-conference workshop, I got blessed and went to Alaska this year, so I have some examples I'll go into with that. I think it's cool to see, get inspiration from these natural channels. But to start, actually, I wanted to start with our beaver meadow complexes here, because I do feel that in Colorado right now, because of the sort of surge in popularity with low-tech process-based restoration, I do think there's a consensus of people understanding that multi-thread channels and islands and mid-channel bars are common in these beaver meadows, right? I think people understand that and observe that, and that's a great thing. This is an amazing, healthy river functioning and way to approach restoration when we have these flat meadows, right? And these, we can call these channels anastomosing, where they're very low energy, right? So all these bars are vegetated and don't get washed out very often. It's very low slope. But what I kind of want to get at and focus on this presentation is I think just about every other river type we have in Colorado also has islands of different types and mid-channel bars, and can be useful in those cases. Yeah, let's see here. So on to Alaska, I guess. So this is a picture I love. I got lucky enough to do a flight tour here and see some of these amazing rivers from above. So this is a larger river over here. For those who know, it's the Susitna River next to Talkeetna. And you could sort of, and then this right here is just a floodplain pocket, right? And the reason you put this up here is just to show that basically every bar type we looked at before, right, can be seen in this photo, right? It's everywhere. And in the main channel, but also in the flow paths, the overflow paths, or the flow paths that are only engaged at high flow, right? And these red lines are sort of representing perceived flow paths from the different vegetation and scars and so on that you can imagine at different flow stages. There's just an immense amount of complexity of multi-thread channels throughout that lead to an immense amount of diversity of habitat, right, at all flow levels and for so many different species. So one more example. Well, there's more examples, I guess, but the aerial over on this side here is the aerial view from Google Earth, and this is from the plane view. So the yellow and the red arrows are pointing out the same features there for reference. So again, within the main channel itself, an amazing amount of complexity of multi-thread channels, and you can sort of perceive how these multi-flow paths would change with flow stage, and change through time as these bars scour and deposit and change. And then alone in the floodplain is just amazing too. I mean, sometimes these rivers, just the floodplain, I wish some of our Colorado rivers look like, right? But just over here alone, right, you see these just gigantic islands and, again, complexity of features. So here's some more examples. So those are big, sort of wide areas. And maybe, I think some people latch on the idea these bars are depositional features, but it doesn't mean that they have to only be in wide, open, flat valleys, right? So this is a completely, like a very large boulder river that's cascading down, and here's a big island right here, a mature island actually with vegetation on it. And there's another one that starts down over here. This is a river that's in the very headwaters up at the top of the mountains, Cascade Channel, and here's a nice little island. Would you believe that? Down over here, this is also looking at another bigger stream, but it's actually in a very confined area. The valley bottom is right on either side, but it has utilized that entire valley bottom and created a complex flow pattern to that. And this is more of an example of a true, more braided stream, high-powered, coming from the glacier that's right here. And this entire area presumably gets flooded and scoured enough every single year and changes flow paths every single year where no vegetation is able to establish, right? So I threw this one up to finish my Alaska spiel, just because I thought it was unbelievable. What rivers can do when they have their entire valley bottoms and their processes, right? You can see all these scars from old glacier activity as well, and this is obviously a confluence here of different rivers and just amazing amount of complexity that you can see here in a history of disturbance and movement of the river through time. But what is mind-blowing is that there is a little town right here, look at that. I'm not going to say that was how safe they are, but they are there and get to enjoy that amazing river. So just to make the point that I'm not just Alaska, right, but in major river systems all over the world, right, we perceive this, right? So the Nile River, Indus River, Amazon River, right, we see these features as well. And then lastly, from the natural examples, a little closer to home, this is one of my favorite river systems I've seen closer to Colorado. This is the Snake River through Grand Teton National Park. And for those of you who know, there is actually a dam upstream of this that would impact this, cut off sediment, impact sediment supply, and water delivery. But still, when the river is able to have its entire floodplain, it does unbelievable things. And again, you can see the complexity of these features. And Derek Booth made a good point yesterday that we also don't want to, I'm not trying to say that we need to have multi-thread absolutely everywhere. And you can see that here in more confined areas where it is more single thread, opens up, multi-thread, goes back, right, just diversity of it. And then again, the floodplain is just amazing in its own right. If you look really close, there's a series of beaver dams all through here and lots of beaver activity out in the floodplain. And this is a good example. I did float this river and saw a lot of beaver in the bank and in the floodplain, right? It's a large river that you wouldn't expect beaver dams to sustain the cross channel again, but they're definitely still there, and they're in the bank and in the floodplain. So to end that on some pretty pictures here, these are some LiDAR images just showing more of these complexity of rivers. I was explaining before that this, you know, for nerdy geomorphologists maybe, or people interested in rivers, this could be artwork basically, right? It's amazing, right? The level of detail we can see and just the history of these streams and how dynamic they've been. And I think it's beautiful. And I can hang one of these in my room and appreciate it. But that sort of segues into this. So unfortunately, though, we're used to seeing impacted streams primarily, though, as we sort of discussed yesterday and sort of just, talking about that perception of rivers, right? So I did do this search for river art, and I think every time I sort of just go places and see art with rivers, I think it's very intriguing, right? Art can show us from a very non-technical standpoint how people perceive rivers and how people perceive them as being beautiful, because these are all presumably art pieces that are supposed to be beautiful landscapes, right? But you can sort of see this sort of implies the perception that people have on rivers, right? So of course, right away, what we notice is every single one is very equal width, it's very uniform, it's single thread and sinuous. And again, it's kind of amazing the lack of riparian vegetation as well. And I mean, learned riparian vegetation blocks views to the river, so they're no good, right? So, but you can also see the impacts here, right? This is a classic impact we see where the river's been shoved over to one side of the valley for land use practices. But this is in beautiful river art, right? And then I'll say my lastly is this is my favorite right here for sure. Certainly is from the engineering side of things as well. So we have the bridge right here, and we have the house where you can step right into the river, and no riparian veg block the view, and no geomorphic hazard whatsoever, I swear. Okay. Yes, we're used to seeing impacted streams. Our Colorado streams are impacted. Yes, we see less islands. We've been suggesting these mid-channel bars in river restoration projects for a while now, and the number one thing we get told is we don't see these islands in Colorado. Where are you getting this? We don't perceive this. And I would like them to change that. I think what they really want to say is we don't see this in restoration, right? And they might not, I don't know, they're just not looking. Sometimes I'll get into why here. So I'm gonna, this is motivated from that, I'm gonna show some examples of major Colorado streams here. So this is the Colorado River. A bunch of examples of different sizes of multi-thread channels, even with all the impacts we have, agriculture and railroad tracks and roads. This is right upstream of our Kent Breeze project. We got told we don't perceive islands in this stream. Why are you suggesting them? This is right upstream, and it's a very mature island and doing awesome things. This is in a confined area. There's still an island here. Occupying the whole valley bottom in that case. Here's the Green River, right? Lots of different types of islands and complexity. Here's it down near Dinosaur, confined in a canyon, but still you see these huge island features, right, as well. Some point bar features, some island features, the whole suite. Here's the Yampa River. This is in the headwaters. Obviously used to be Beaver Meadow and is now impacted, but still here we see a bunch of mid-channel bar features. Here's further down, less confined area, we see that too. Here's it in the canyon, we also see the mid-channel bars, right? White River, here's a bunch of examples, also in proximity to impacts in agriculture and so on. And then lastly here, because this is easy because we drive this all the time, this is the Poudre Canyon and a few more examples. So this is a very big island, and this is just challenging the idea again that we've been told a lot that these are depositional features and they shouldn't be in these sort of confined areas or higher power areas, right? You wouldn't see them. But this is a large mid-channel bar that has cottonwood, actually from the Black Hollow blowout for people familiar. Which is a benefit of the island, right, to retain that. Here's a little island where the stream just happened to get a little wider here and it deposited out, and there's a little island that formed and just creating great habitat around it. Okay, so why do we see less islands in impacted streams? There are islands in impacted streams, but we definitely see less of them, right? So we talked about this yesterday, but in summary, I think we are, we've had a history of suppressing flooding disturbances that are natural for streams, right? So all of these impacts sort of combine to simplify streams and eliminate these features because they're perceived as bad or unstable, right? And again, sometimes even in the name of restoration, right? So this is an example of a stream that has bank armoring and grade control and actually had the riparian vegetation removed. So for the viewscape from these apartments, and it was in the name of restoration. Okay, so why don't we see the islands in restoration design? So a couple thoughts on that. So as we were hinting at before, they're perceived as unstable and unhealthy by many here. People would say it's a feature that indicates excessive deposition, right? Meaning it's unstable. It's thought to create bank erosion, which is also thought to be an unhealthy condition. They most certainly can create bank erosion, and they can even be used to create bank erosion strategically. But is that a bad thing? It just needs to be planned for and understood. And then, like I was saying earlier, I do think we just haven't seen examples of it in restoration here in Colorado. So it's just there's been this focus on single thread channels and focus on stability. And we're used to seeing these impacted streams correlating to that last one. And then honestly, single thread streams are easy to design and they're easy to calculate, right? I mean, I can say that from my engineering side. They're easy to permit too, right? Things like floodplain development permits and stuff. It's really hard to model these things, and it gets very complex. It's easy to just throw out a single thread stream, right? That's easy to calculate and has less uncertainty maybe, or at least perceived less uncertainty. So why create these bars? Some of the, we kind of got to this, but hopefully I've indicated that they are observed in well-functioning healthy systems across the world and almost all river types that I've seen. They create great flow habitat complexity. They can create, as this example over here, pool and riffle habitat. Locally, they can create habitat for all life stages of fish and promote flushing flows for macroinvertebrates, all in a pretty small area, right? And we can argue that they, specific to Colorado too, is they can create disturbance more readily than a point bar because it's more engaged with flow, right? It's right in the middle of the stream. Certainly if you have large wood jams and stuff like that, like this one as well, to help split the flow and force those erosion and sedimentation to happen. Obviously that's very important in our Colorado streams as we have less stream power from reduced water and just less water in general since we're a dry climate. So being bold and putting these right in the middle of the stream, thank you, it can be really helpful for getting those processes kick-started sooner, right, than just going with a more traditional approach. And then, of course, they can store sediment behind them and nutrients and wood. This feature right here is upstream of a major highway. It has caught an immense amount of wood, and I think that's a positive thing as long as it's monitored. They can even maybe be strategically, we've talked about utilizing wood structures and islands to, in floodplain connection and all that, as a benefit to store wood upstream of infrastructure, right, as long as it's monitored in that case. And then one thing you can think about is that it actually creates more than two riverbanks, right? Like a single thread channel, you have left and right riverbank, and with this mid-channel bar, there's sort of four. And there's availability for riparian vegetation, and as we sort of talked about in our workshop, gravel augmentation might be something that becomes more of a thing in Colorado. With dams cutting off sediment supply, we might need ways to augment that. Essentially, these islands can be like gravel augmentation. You're putting gravel in the stream, and it can erode those banks and create localized sediment supply, right, if you plan it that way. Okay, so and then lastly, I just wanted to run through some examples that we've done here in Colorado. And focused on, sorry, just to make a point here, these are all focused on in-channel. I do think in Colorado people have done well and have used the technique of creating overflow paths. It can obviously be more bold and more overflow paths and so on, but these are just focused mostly in the channel. So all these photos here showing before on the left and after on the right. This is at River Bluffs in the Poudre River. So before it was completely featureless channel, dredged out and levied and straightened back in the 50s. You can see from the aerial view here. And this is a bar feature that was put in and wood structure put in on the front. This is more close to after construction, right? It's very bare, but has already sort of created riffle habitat down here and pool habitat from scour around the front of it. And this is more recently. And it has elongated, and the riffles are down a little further, but it still creates great pool habitat above it, and now the vegetation is starting to come in on the island and everywhere else, and that will also help it create more disturbance as well as that grows in. This is on the Yampa River. This is before here. This is sort of it was sort of a wider area that is a decent riffle, like functioning riffle in a single thread standpoint, but we put in this island here. The client wanted it to be narrowed in a single thread way, but we suggested doing it in this mid-channel bar fashion. So this is just, again, wood on the front and a mid-channel bar with transplants and things like that. This is from downstream looking up. So again, sort of just like a uniform riffle run here. There is some overhead cover habitat around the side. But now this is with the bar after one runoff, or the mid-channel bar in there, sorry. This was an existing little island right here. And this entire island right here is new, created from the scour and deposition that has happened around the island. And you can see the complexity of flow that's created and different types of habitat is created from slow and fast water. And it's been able to mobilize the sediment and flush flows, which was a goal in the project for macroinvertebrates. This is on the White River, again, an area that was sort of more wide. So another thing to point out here is, of course, we try to work with what the river's showing you, of course. So this area had a sort of a mid-channel bar already forming here. It was just lower, so we basically just enhanced that and added transplants to it. This is downstream looking up. Another thing we did, there was an existing overflow path here that we just cut down a little bit more. And then this is the after construction result here, and creates again a lot more complexity and multiple flow paths in this area that was wider. This is the North Platte, same type of thing. One thing to mention here that's really cool to me is we saw this on several of these mid-channel bars that we put in, that beaver dams were immediately built on one side of them because that width that the island created was more suitable than them building all the way across the stream. So to wrap up, one thing to mention is you can obviously do this in a more active way and construct the island the way you want it, or you can do it in a more passive approach and try to just promote the river to do it. And there's obviously considerations from both sides. So in a more active approach, I just obviously want to say that we need to think about it in true to process-based design, understand our system, and know what appropriate island and bar types would be for your river system, right? Appropriate materials that are native materials for the area. And the height and width of the bar obviously affects the hydraulics. We can use hydraulic modeling to predict some of that stuff to help communicate it to clients to let them know what this feature will do once it's installed. We've used that, but knowing that it will change through time, and that's okay. And moreover, on the passive approach, this is very intriguing to me, but can be challenging, and I think some of the examples Derek Booth showed yesterday also challenged that with somewhat more of a passive approach. You might need to wait a long time for it to happen, or you might need to be, if you really want something to happen, you might need to push it a little bit more. Wood jams and even beaver simulated structures and so on, you need that sediment supply to be there in order to create the islands. And then floodplain connection, always over-connecting for multi-thread channels, as we talked about. I think people are doing that here, but over-connecting and going bolder, I think, will help us immensely. And then lastly, if we can give room for the river and just let it go, that would be amazing. But the processes have to be there for it to do anything and be able to adjust and create natural function, and we have to be patient if we want to go with that approach. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question for Travis? We just have a little bit of time. Yeah.
I'm curious what kind of 404 permitting that you are able to get for these processes. Have you been able to get like nationwide permits? Have you had to go individual?
Yeah, that's you mean just correlated, for instance, to the islands at all, or
Doing these projects, yeah.
Oh, these projects, yeah, it's different for every scenario. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on it, but we've used both for depending on the project. Yeah.
Never individual.
Oh, never individual. Okay, there you go. That's a good show. How much I know.
Well, I've done lots of individual permits lately.
Yeah, we've never had to do individual.
Oh, okay, nice. Well, there you go. Sorry about that. Should ask Julie to start. Is there any, Joel?
Really like this idea that you're kind of throwing out there and showing some examples in Colorado. One of the things I just wanted to see if you could comment on is identifying areas where it's appropriate, like where islands might naturally form. Thinking about the presentations yesterday of like, you can just put something somewhere, right? And
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously it's really complex and site-specific and all that kind of stuff, and it's hard to get into. But generally speaking, I mean, easily enough, we see where areas that have widened out, the channel is widened out, you'll see that deposition in the middle starting to occur. And sometimes, you know, whatever, bias to the left or right side, whatever it is, there's deposition that starts to occur in that sort of overly widened area. But I think a good thing to mention on some of these, and certainly examples on the bigger rivers in Colorado, is is that a lot of those islands, I would think, were created by large events historically more, right? Like one single event that brought a lot of sediment in, and maybe a wider area happened to deposit all out. A lot of those have mature trees on top, and of indicating that it's been there quite a long time, right? So I think those indicate a lot about the historic processes that were here and maybe not here anymore, so that's definitely worth considering too. And that's sort of tying into the passive approach and how well that might actually work in Colorado. If the sediment doesn't move, then you can't build these bars, right? So it's challenging.
All right, we're going to stop there, but find Travis later. Thank you. Our next presenter is Johannes Beeby. He is a river scientist, designer with Stillwater Sciences. He's been working there for, maybe not there, but in the field for 14 years as a technical lead on numerous and diverse river projects across Colorado. Johannes believes successful river restoration should be based on applied geomorphic design built on comprehensive understanding of the process dynamics that drive and shape dynamic fluvial systems and their functions. Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so some of you who were in the workshop yesterday, some of these will be repeat again, so I'm sorry about that. But I'll try to get through this as quick as I can. So basically we're going to be talking about, can a river be too altered to be restored? So I'm basically quickly going to just remind everyone what river system processes are, and then we'll talk about altered processes. What are we seeing here, and then kind of how that implies with the level of effort you need to take it during restoration. We'll quickly look at Kemp Breeze, and then we'll have a little maybe some questions and talk about what should the future of restoration look like here potentially. So again, river system processes, everyone's probably seen Lane's Balance on the right side from 1955. Kind of the idea here is that the form that the river takes, the functions you're getting out of it, the shape of it, it's a balance between the sediment and the water inputs. So if you have more sediment going into the system, you might lean towards aggradation in the system, so it's kind of a balance, right? So this was from the 50s, and then in 2019, Castro and Thorne kind of added the biology to this component. So they understood that, you know, things like beaver, riparian vegetation, these are different controls on what we see out in that river and the shape it's going to take. So the combination of the biology, the geology, the hydrology now, not just those two anymore, is kind of dependent on what we're seeing going on with that river channel. So Colorado, you know, many of our rivers have altered processes. It's just something they have out here. Some even have severe enough alteration, the river's ability to self-heal is gone. So what that means is, you know, rivers have processes, and those processes are what make that river function. Sometimes those are broken, and sometimes that river cannot just self-heal. So some of the major stressors we see out here in Colorado, obviously dams and diversions. You know, hydrologic alteration is a really big thing we see out on our rivers. We usually see things, these are just a couple too, so there's more than this, but we usually see reductions in peak flow, magnitude, duration, frequency. We often have water releases through summer, so a lot of our rivers do act kind of more like canals often. From the geologic side, the dams do trap sediment, so below dams we have a cutoff in sediment supply. And then from biology, we also have a cutoff wood supply. They can be fish passage barriers, and then obviously the flooding of the reservoir obviously has impacts on more of the biology upstream. Land use change is a big one we see out here in Colorado. So again, just sticking with that triangle, the hydrology, geology, biology. From the flow perspective, we usually, you know, urban areas, we can see increased storm runoff. We have a reduced flood attenuation with areas like this where you can see the channel is completely surrounded by ponds. You know, it's a straight through kind of idea. There's no floodplain connection occurring. From the geology side, we see all the riprap cutting off sediment supply. So areas like this, we no longer kind of have that sediment supply coming in from banks. There's a lot of good papers out there now talking about how that's actually had a huge impact on our rivers. And then biology, again, reduced disturbance events, reduced floodplain connectivity, the riparian vegetation removal, oftentimes like Travis mentioned, or even just reduction. And then with that, we get reduced wood supply, beaver removal. So all these things have impacts on the river's processes and what they end up looking like. So with this, how does this then relate to how do we fix these rivers that have these broken processes? So again, this is just kind of a spectrum, you know, so if we start here, the level of system alteration, so from low to high, the higher the alteration, the higher the level of intervention is necessary for restoration. And with that, then also the cost goes up. And then opposite to that, the ability of the river to self-heal goes down. So again, the level of effort we need to do in restoration, the more altered those processes, the more we have to do to try to fix those. So now when we're talking about severely altered systems, systems where those processes are really broken, maybe multiple processes are broken, maybe there's nothing we can do about some of these processes, we need to start asking the question, you know, we heard it from Derek and Peter yesterday, will a reach scale approach to restoring watershed scale stressors work through time, or are they just Band-Aids? So, you know, are we actually fixing what's broken in these systems by doing little chunks over space? And then can we keep afford doing this? You know, with the more broken, for these severely altered systems, they're expensive to fix. We're fixing half-mile chunks for a lot of money. So can we afford to keep doing this? You know, areas like the Northwest have salmon, steelhead, they have federal money coming in. We don't really have that in Colorado. So a lot of the rivers where we have to do more restoration, they're expensive. And so is there a better approach we can be taking? So for this, I just want to take a little case study at Kemp Breeze. So Kemp Breeze is a state wildlife area in Colorado Parks Wildlife property. And so basically this project is the first phase of the Upper Colorado River Habitat Project. So this is part of the Windy Gap firming project. It's part of the mitigation to come out of that. So there's going to be approximately $4 million to improve habitat for some of the 17-mile stretch from Windy Gap down to basically Kemp Breeze. So it's not meant to fix it all. It's just meant to fix pockets of it. So just a little location background. Kemp Breeze sits down here near Parshall, so Windy Gap's up here. We have other kind of dams and reservoirs upstream and also in the Williams Fork, which comes in here. So our current project reaches here. I want to say the whole thing started to be about a mile. We ended up being about a half mile in the end just due to budget. So Kemp Breeze, if you weren't in the workshop yesterday, it's an area that we maybe has been historically channelized. You can kind of see some other things happening, but basically this river has rock spurs, there's a little bedrock control. It's very kind of nice, wide, homogeneous channel for the most part, as you can see. So the project goals were small, only a few. But I mean, I do give CPW credit. The goals they listed weren't just habitat. Oftentimes we see let's fix habitat, riparian aquatic. That's the goal of the project. So with them, the first one here is improve sediment transport processes. So they understood that there's obviously issues going on in that river. They're seeing no more mottled sculpin. They're seeing a decline in salmon fly. They're seeing just a decline in trout biomass, all these things, and they related it back to riffles aren't flushing anymore along the Colorado River below Windy Gap for the most part. They're seeing more clogged interstitial spaces, and so this is leading to a decline in the biology throughout Kemp Breeze. So they really wanted to see how can we go about improving flushing flows through the reach. So again, just to go back to the triangle, some of the hydrologic impacts, we have a lot of water going off to the other side of, over to the Front Range. And then obviously on the Williams Fork too, we have water being taken out farther up on the Fraser. So basically the watershed upstream of our project reach is heavily impacted from water. It's a fact. And then going through this, so Eric Richer with CPW did a really great hydrology analysis to start with. So just giving a quick summary, I don't have enough time to go in depth, so you kind of have to trust me, which is scary. But existing conditions hydrology. Basically, the current flow regime is altered. There is going to be future changes still to come once there's more water taken out as well. We don't know what that will look like exactly. But what we've seen is basically peak flow magnitude, duration, frequency have been reduced. And then we also see that the summer flows can be artificially high as well. So it kind of, the Colorado River where we are kind of just acts more like a canal for a lot of it. So you can see just in this hydrograph, the Williams Fork, blue is above the dam and orange is below the dam. So you can even see in some years the peak flow, where we don't get a good peak flow year above the dam, they're releasing everything from the reservoir through the summer months for different calls, fish flows, things like that. But you can see there is a kind of shift in when flows are captured and when they're released. This has an impact on the base flows through summer months. So this channel has kind of remained over widened and frozen through time, and we think part of it might be that it's basically a wetted channel for the most part, and vegetation can't encroach when it might be able to and self-heal, right? So it doesn't have that ability to self-heal. So looking at historical aerials, same thing, 1938, 2016, it's basically the same. Already in 1938, we see land use impacts. There's already a bridge there, but nothing's really changed along this property at all, which kind of begs the question of why? Why hasn't this river, you know, we know flows are being taken out of it. Why is it not shrunk? Why is it not miniaturized through time? So when we think about stream evolution model, basically, I'm not going to go into describing what all of this is, but on the stream evolution model, we assume this is either going to be channelized or maybe even arrested degradation. This channel does contain the 100-year flow in it. There's no real floodplain connection. So, you know, it's either channelized or arrested degradation, but it's essentially this kind of frozen channel at this point. So just a summary, basically we have decreased sediment transport capacity and supply. Both the river doesn't have the power to move sediment into the reach anymore, and also we have a lack of just sediment supply in general coming down the system due to a lot of the dams. So the channel's essentially frozen. We've seen that the bed has armored through time. A lot of those finer gradations have moved out, and we're left with this really kind of armored bed. And with that, then the interstitial space has also decreased. We see a lot of fines getting in there on the receding limb. So from the biological standpoint, we do see historical beaver activity everywhere throughout the reach. There is some sign, we do see, you know, willow cuttings floating down to our reach, but there's no real current activity within our project reach. They're probably just upstream. And then wood supply is also really important. You know, both the wood supply and riparian vegetation extent have been impacted by land use changes. All that agriculture is really windowed down both the cottonwoods and also just willows and everything else you'd find out there. And then upstream bank armoring, flow alteration has decreased the frequency of floodplain connection and those disturbance events that would have brought wood and would have brought change to that channel. Both of those have been limited through time. So just again, you know, what would we possibly expected this channel to do from, you know, 1930 on with more flow extraction? We probably would have expected more sediment to deposit, more bars to develop, and we probably would have expected vegetation to then encroach in those bars. We do see that happening on a lot of rivers that have flow taken out of it. On Kent Breeze, we have not seen that. You know, it's literally been the same. Its processes maybe are broken enough to where it couldn't self-heal. So the channels remained over widened. There's a lack of sediment supply capacity. So we're not getting that sediment deposition. There hasn't been any new bars within our reach since 1938. The lack of wood supply to deposit out maybe trap sediment if there was sediment in that reach. Lack of disturbance events, like Travis was mentioning, these are really, really important. These are the kinds of flow events that really reset the whole system. And we just don't really get those events that much anymore out here. And then obviously it's a really wide channel. There is some higher up terraces, and the 100 years basically connected in that. So we have a really narrow buffer. So at high flow, it is kind of moving through here, but it's not spreading out and dropping sediment if there was sediment. And then finally, yeah, those high summer flows are possibly keeping the wetted bank. I mean, this is even in winter, you can see there's just barely a little bit of that bar, and some of the flows are even higher. So flow is from bank to bank, so there's really nowhere for vegetation to encroach. So all that's to say, it's complicated. So when we look at the processes, the drivers, the response of what we're seeing out there, we see that dams, diversion, land use change. You know, these are three of the major stresses we're seeing at Kent Breeze, and these impact things, hydrology, biology, geology, so the green, the orange, and the blue. So increased blaze flows, vegetation can encroach, channel remains over widened, we're seeing the biological impacts. Reduced peak flows, we decrease disturbance events, we've decreased sediment transport processes, riffles flush less, channel remains over widened, and then we see biology. So it's all connected. It's hard to really point at one big thing to do because processes are connected. So what we did was we took a process-based approach to design, and everyone's been talking about it, so hopefully you kind of know what it is now, but we basically want to restore the system processes and lead to a natural ecological resilience, basically allow the river to adjust through space and time as would be expected. There's other approaches where we can push the system in the right direction to self-heal if it has those processes. So a lot of times you don't have to do heavy-handed. Maybe it's smaller little approaches and the river has that ability to self-heal. And then also is always using diversity of solutions, not just doing your typical floodplain benches or things like that. Always point out diversity of different solutions to see what works. So we focused on restoring the sediment transport processes. There's obviously more processes going on, but from a design perspective, what we're doing is trying to improve this. That was the major goal of the project. How do we do that? Channel dimension, width, slope, floodplain connection, large wood, vegetation. These are all kind of drivers of how we can improve sediment transport processes. Some of the analysis tools and the desired functions, maybe we'll get flushing riffles again, self-sustaining pool habitat, sediment storage, improved riparian habitat, and all that goes to their goals. So this was kind of the process we took through when thinking about how we were going to approach this. So in general, we did active restoration treatments. So we did do a bunch of channel narrowing, both multi-thread and single-thread sections. We're doing one reach. We're doing de-armoring. So this was something that was brought up a long time ago in Grand County. Can we just go out with a machine and mix up the riffles and see if that works and see if that keeps them clean? So we are going to try this in one riffle upstream as a control just to see how that compares to some of the other treatments. Floodplain connection, obviously there's a lot of floodplain connection occurring with the project. Large wood structures are going to be a big portion of the design as well. These active treatments will get you quicker results, but it's more effort in the short term, but you do get maybe a little less uncertainty of how you'd expect the outcome to come. On the passive side, again, using large wood structures in a different way, not maybe putting some in the middle of the channel, but not really building islands with them, like Travis mentioned. Are we increasing sediment transport supply to a point where we might actually be able to trap some sediment behind the structures themselves? So that's something we want to look at as well. And then the idea of gravel augmentation. So I'll talk about this a little bit more, but obviously historically it's used in the Northwest more for spawning. Here we're looking at gravel augmentation more from a channel narrowing through time. We know we don't have a sediment supply, so if we're going to really restore processes, we kind of need to give it sediment supply back. So we do want to do some gravel augmentation, some pilot kind of studies on that with this project. And then finally, adaptive management, we really want to try to, I'll talk about this again later, but we really want to try to make sure people understand we can't just go out to a river once, touch it, and never look back at it again. It happens too much. So we really want to focus on this monitoring aspect to see, especially if some of these more passive treatments did work. So future phases can learn from it. Generally, slower results, more effort in the long term, greater uncertainty with passive approaches. So this is just a quick little hydraulic 2D model. So we're looking at velocity, existing conditions of the Q1.5, proposed conditions of Q1.5. So generally speaking, here's the bridge, everything downstream. We worked in this lower half. We prioritized that the upper half was more functional. You can kind of see some islands developing. It had more function through here. You can kind of see that as compared to downstream where it's a little more homogeneous here, and these are the rock spurs. They're just kind of creating little artificial hits. And then that's that bedrock riffle. But generally the approach was upstream of that bedrock riffle, we have 3 channels going in. So really large islands, just like we see upstream, where there's also a bedrock control, kind of controlling that and the sediment depositing there. So this was an extremely over-widened section of the river, so we decided to take a bigger approach, narrow it down, not just through single thread, but through multi-thread channels. But you can also see at the Q1.5, we have overflow channels across the islands, and and farther down we have one little island here, but then we're staying single thread with benching down here. So diversity of solutions. The Q5, we go up, we have more floodplain connections. So now we're really overtopping those islands. We have overflow channels that are now engaged farther out through this forest and then on this side as well. So again, floodplain connection, a lot of it is budget-based. This channel was the 100 years contained in it, so cutting down any floodplain was about a 6-7 foot cut to try to get down to it, so it gets very expensive very quick, so we had to prioritize and choose where and when we're going to do it, and it's really nice to have a diversity of flow connections, right? So as flow goes up, you start engaging different channels. So some of the things we really wanted to do out here and really learn from is the use of wood structures. So we really want to do pile-driven structures out here. They've been doing these in the Northwest for a while. We've done boulder ballast for a long time. There's limitations with it. With the pile structures, we're able to get a bigger height. We're able to pretty much make them bigger, and it's okay if the river adjusts and moves around them. They're going to be still stable, and they're still going to provide function as opposed to boulder ballast, which might start having structural issues and start to fall apart through time. So these wood structures are being used for a couple different things. We want to both narrow the channel. So some areas we're just putting the wood structures in where we didn't have enough money to narrow it up to maybe what we thought would have improved sediment transport processes. So we're going to put wood structures in to cause localized narrowing. And what that'll do will also increase velocities, so we might get increased riffle flushing with some of these wood structures as well. So it might not be the whole riffle, but just sediment transport's patchy anyway. So we're just trying to create more patches that might move. And then complex habitat, obviously pool scour, overhead cover, just trying to create more complexity throughout the channel. And then ideally, like I mentioned, at the bottom end of our reach, we're going to throw in a couple of these mid-channel structures. Ideally, if we are moving sediment through our reach now, hopefully some of that ends up and starts depositing behind our structure. So these are kind of the questions we really want to see. Is it working or not? And then also using, there are some banks that do have some good gravel supply, so putting structures close to the bank to create erosion to get localized sediment supply through time is another way. We're going to see if we can try to do new approaches to this. So finally, gravel augmentation. One of the things we're really excited about with this, because it's kind of like a pilot project out here for this. Will it work? We don't know. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the idea is, these little red boxes, you can see the wood structures, little red boxes, we want to provide sediment supply through time, right? So we want the channel to continue to narrow through time. We didn't have budget to narrow it to what we thought we would need to get riffles flushing again. But we also, so with this, hopefully if we start placing some of these piles of different coarse bed material near these high velocity zones, we might actually get them moving. We are going to put some in just other areas that are just kind of not near wood structures too, because we're looking at this kind of like an experiment, right? We want to throw gravel out there. If this is going to apply to other areas of the Colorado River in the future, potentially, we need to test it all. We need to see, did the sediment move? Where did it move? How did we get it to move? And then finally, just, the native bed is really coarse out there. It has been armored through time, so we are missing a lot of that spawning gravel sizes. So just even getting that full gradation back in there will provide a better supply of just sediment for other biological considerations. All that said, there's a lot of uncertainty. We like to come in here and be designers and say, hey, we're going to do this for you, and it's great, and it's all going to be perfect, don't worry, right? But half the time, we're doing our best. We're taking really educated guesses. We're doing the science. We're doing the analyses, but things don't always work. Like Derek had a really good talk yesterday about, his restoration working, and it depends, right? It is working, but for how long and things like that. So we should be questioning ourselves and how good these treatments are. So in general, will the project function through time with no incoming sediment supply? We now have a channel where we've increased sediment transport capacity, but there's still no supply coming in. So is our channel, according to Lane's balance, is our channel just going to start to cut down to grade through time, right? There's no sediment coming in, so we're moving it through. What's going to happen to our channel? So hence the gravel augmentation. Early on, we told CPW, we can do this for you. We can narrow the channel, but you still don't have sediment supply. So in order for this to work, do we need to be adding sediment supply? So that's where we got on to trying to add gravel augmentation. But even with that, our rivers, especially on the Colorado River, we don't get the peak flows we used to. We don't get the duration of the peak flows we used to, so sediment movement on these channels is really limited. It's like little shuffles if it is moving, right? So will we actually see any movement with the sediment, and how long will it take to move and distribute through the system? So bigger picture, did we actually fix the broken processes? Or is a reach-based approach to restoration in severely altered systems just spread out Band-Aids that will eventually lose function? It's a real question. It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. It's not to point fingers at us and say, what are we doing? We're wasting money? I don't think we're wasting money. It's just, can we be doing it a better way potentially? So even if this project is successful, it was really expensive. That $4 million to touch as much of the 17 miles, there's not going to be much money left to do the rest of it. So we did about a half mile with that money. It was worth it. But what are we going to do for money for the rest of it, right? Is this too expensive approach? The level of that system alteration was so high that we actually had to go in and do a lot of restoration to try to fix it. The ability to self-heal was gone. And then, so is there a different approach we should be taking that would help restore processes for larger sections of river over longer timescales? So this is kind of stuff we've been thinking about, and I want to throw it out to you guys to go home and think about too. What could future restoration look like in the upper Colorado River or other highly altered rivers? So we're really talking about these severely impacted rivers where those processes are so broken it can't self-heal anymore. So maybe more of passive approaches. Can we do flow releases to increase sediment transport capacity? Is this possible? Oftentimes trying to get more water back in the rivers, it's hard, it's not possible. But it's something we should still be asking about. We know they are doing releases. Places like the North Platte for fishing, they're doing, week-long flushing flows for the trout. So can we change how we're releasing flows in the peak time, maybe to get a couple days of higher flow events that will actually move sediment? I know it's hard, but it's something we should still always go back to. And then maybe we should be doing gravel and wood augmentation over larger areas. We have 17 miles of the Colorado River. Should we be dumping gravel? Should we be dumping wood in more sections of this river? Let it distribute through time. Let that sediment get in there. Will the channel narrow itself through time? Will the wood rack up and create areas where sediment can deposit? Is that our better approach? Is that a better way to spend our money? No matter what, all of that requires patience. You do that, this river might not have the flows to actually move that sediment. These are all questions we don't know, right? So we need to figure this out, but it's something we could talk about and learn. So I really want to get rid of the no more one and done approach. No more going out there and just doing your restoration, walking away from it, saying we're good and not looking at it ever again. We really need to kind of look at it more of a phased approach, ideally, especially with costs. A lot of the projects we've done, we're starting to move towards doing some active, some passive, doing phases of it, seeing what's working, seeing what's not. Problem is the funding doesn't work that way, right? The funding doesn't allow us to take that approach a lot of the time. So what can we do about that? And then finally, just the summary takeaway stuff I would like you guys to go home with is, sometimes the extent of the system alteration precludes self-healing. So sometimes in severely altered systems, that river needs more work. It can't fix it on its own. And if you go in there and do it, will it work and for how long will it work? We should be asking ourselves that. And then ultra processes must be addressed to truly restore functions. You can't just go out there and make it a certain channel width and call it good. You actually need to think about all the other water, sediment, biological processes that are happening, and are you addressing those? Active restoration, so taking that more heavy-handed approach, might be needed on some of these highly altered systems, but it still might not be sufficient on its own. We might have to do gravel augmentation. We might have to do some of these passive approaches to make sure the active work has longevity. Finally, passive restoration takes longer to deliver results. It does have that adaptive management approach, but it may be cheaper and it might have a larger area of influence. So these are things that we really want to continue to look into. So the whole point of this is that Kent Breeze project's in construction now. I mean, we've been talking to people at CCU. We try to get students involved because we really want to get monitoring done on the gravel augmentation. We feel like this is a really important project to understand, can the Colorado River still move sediment? And can we apply gravel augmentation in larger areas of this? So we're still trying to get that funding to try to get a grad student on to see if we can monitor this and learn from this. So then the next pot of money isn't spent on doing something that maybe didn't work. So that's it.
Does anyone have questions? Peter. Oh, no.
That's fun. I enjoyed that, and lots of really good questions and considerations. I'm just wondering if you can describe to me how you're approaching adaptive management, your learning paradigm going forward. How's that structured and how's it getting paid for? It seems like this is you're just going to have to keep rethinking and checking in on this, and maybe doing some adjustments along the way.
Yes, 100%. So there is no structure, and that's part of the problem, right? This was brought to it as a shovel-ready project. Go in, do the work, we're good. CPW is going to be doing monitoring on the aquatic side, trout, bugs, things like that. But once we started with the approach of gravel augmentation, all that, we've been doing just our own time to go try to talk to Sarah Rathburn, people like that, with CPW, try to get grad students. So we were thinking about sending you an email about helping with funding for future monitoring efforts. No, but that's the truth. A lot of our projects don't have it set up that way. A lot of times it's tied to funding. Here it's just, I don't think gravel augmentation was a thought when they were first thinking about this. Yeah. Yes, well, it got broken into 2 phases, but because of construction budget, not because of adaptive management, so. Yeah. Oh, yeah, hey, Chris. Yeah. Oh, sweet, okay. Perfect. Great, okay, awesome. Thank you, Chris. That's great. Yeah, tease me.
What is the process for installing some of those wood pile systems where you have really tough substrate? You have to get those things in 2/3 of the way buried, right?
Yeah. So right now we are running into bedrock issues at Kent Breeze. So we are going to get pile structures in some areas, but believe it or not, the Colorado River through Kent Breeze literally has about 10 inches of coarse bed material before you hit shale in some places. So you can think about that if you want. But yes, so yeah. So usually with the pile-driven structures, driving them down until you get, you design them for that kind of scour depth and that embedment depth that you need to get stable. So it's calculating that. So ideally they're pile-driven from there.
Thank you. That was awesome. So our next presentation is a little bit different format. We have 3 presenters, and they're going to do a short slide presentation to introduce you to a project that we all worked on together. But really the heart of this presentation is going to be question and answer. So we've really intentionally kind of shrunk down the slide part because we want to hear from you guys. We want to hear what questions or thoughts or wonderings you guys have about working in beaver-related or beaver-mediated systems, beaver restoration, stage 0. Like really, we have a great team here, so we'll take any kind of questions you guys are thinking of, and I'm telling you about this now so you can think about it and get ready as you listen to the introduction. So I'm going to introduce our, our speakers. We have Mark Beardsley, who you guys all know is a riparian hero. And he's also like a lifelong skeptic. He thinks and rethinks and thinks again and dissects it from a different way. So I promise whatever aspect you guys have questions about for beaver-related restorations, he has put so much thought into it and analyzed it from every different way. So we also have Gizzi with Arable Earth. She's an ecologist and restoration practitioner. She has a lot of experience in riparian systems, but has been working in beaver systems for the past 3 years-ish. So she kind of brings a different perspective, and she has an amazing ability to absorb and apply and then communicate information. It's impressive. So we're lucky to have her input and perspective today. And then lastly, we have Ashley Hom, who's a hydrologist with the Forest Service. And she is also kind of a ninja. She can navigate regulatory process and like keep her coworkers happy and lead a field trip for funders. It's kind of impressive. Her ability to keep projects moving forward is awesome. So I'll turn it over to these guys.
So I'll give you a quick introduction to Trail Creek and to this project that we did together. This is Trail Creek. It's a small, we're going to be talking about small creeks now. These flow like a CFS to maybe 5 CFS, you know, in the summertime. They're also wetlands. And, you know, a lot of what we do to these systems depends on the lens through which we see them. When we look at them as wetlands, I think the solutions to them sometimes seem quite simple, and when we look at them as streams, they might sometimes seem a little bit more complex. But what we're going to look at is 2 different manifestations of the same system. So this is Trail Creek, a tiny creek in Taylor Park, and this is Red Mountain Creek. And what we think is, or what we see is we've got a lot of the Taylor Park watershed. A lot of our watershed is systems in this condition, and we have a very few examples of systems in this condition, Red Mountain Creek and Trail Creek. So our project is on Trail Creek. You know, we can classify and look at these systems in so many different ways. This could be a stage 0 system. This could be a stage 3 system, an incised channel running through this. However we're looking at it, this is an impaired stream. And as Travis said, we're used to looking at impaired streams. And I would say this is a more healthy stream, or a more healthy wetland and an impaired wetland. If I'm looking at this through my wetland lenses, this is a wetland with a drain through it that's dried it out. Okay, so so here's our point with the sustaining Colorado watersheds, is that I think our watershed had normally had lots of these, and they're very functional. And now it has lots of these, and there's less function. So if we want sustainable watersheds, especially up here in the headwaters, the upper part of the Gunnison, we want more of these and less of these. So what's the difference between that one and this one? The big one. That's really the main thing that's missing. This is a very simple solution, a very simple approach. Oh, my words didn't get on there. And there was going to be, surprise, another citation of Timothy Beachy's paper on process-based restoration, which was going to have the 4 principles of process-based restoration, and thinking of beavers, using beavers as an example, as one example of many possible examples of process-based restoration. And I was going to put those principles up for one reason, because a very insightful question came up yesterday at the end of Peter's Skidmore's talk, was about this apparent sort of contradiction or conflict between, we say we're going for self-sustaining systems when we're doing process-based restoration. So what's all this emphasis on adaptive management, and why do we have to keep doing it? And the main reason, I think, I don't think it's actually a contradiction. I think in this case, with beavers, and with the difference between this system on the left and the system on the right, is that with process-based restoration, one of the key principles is to address, first of all, the main cause of the issue, which we just identified might be beavers, but to identify the problem, or to address the problem at the scale with which it's happening. So if the issue is beavers, can we solve this with a reach scale solution? Well, beavers are the problem with, you know, if we're lacking beavers in this situation, the beaver metapopulation is the thing that's been depressed. They've been hunted out, and the population might be at like 5% overall of Taylor Park. So if we can't just put some animals back here and expect them to stay forever and have this self-sustaining system. So again, so that's just to kind of stimulate a little bit of thought, as like, so why are we doing adaptive management? If we're going to just mimic beavers, then we better plan on coming back often. If we can promote and sustain them to their population to keep recirculating more and more beavers onto this site to do that restoration, then we're moving towards a self-sustaining thing. How do you do that? You scale that up to the scale of the problem, which is looking at the whole watershed and that metapopulation. Okay, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, and it's probably a little too much detail, but stimulate some questions for later. I'm going to turn it over now to Ashley and let these two explain the rest of what we did.
Thanks, Mark. Don't you love his energy? I feel like if you get to work with Mark and Jess, you just feel super lucky. It's really cool. So may you all get to work with them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about partnerships. I'm Ashley Halm. I'm with the Forest Service. And as Mark mentioned, we were going to be talking here about Trail Creek. And so Trail Creek is just north of Gunnison, and it is on public lands. And I just really want to emphasize a little point here with public lands, that Trail Creek is in Gunnison County, and Gunnison County is about 85% public lands. And we, the Forest Service, are lucky enough and fortunate enough to help manage it, but the Forest Service does not own it. This land is your land. This land is our land. It's like I could break into song. This land is our land. But that is the lyrics, isn't it? But to the point that these are your public lands. In our country, we have some of the most pristine, beautiful places that we get to work. We have this really unique structure in our country where we have these public lands. And so I just want to really emphasize that the Forest Service or BLM or National Parks or CPW, we don't own that. That is just us being lucky enough to manage. You all own that. And so more than ever, we need these partnerships as land managers. We need contractors, we need partners, we need volunteers, we need scientists and students if we're going to go into the future. And partnerships is what is so fun, because it's what makes this work enjoyable. It's what makes this work successful, and it's definitely what is the only way that this work is ever going to go to pace and scale. So Trail Creek lent itself so beautifully to these partnerships, and is what made this Trail Creek such a fun project. As you'll see, we had a lot of really amazing contractors. Allie came in, and Mark Beardsley, and we had a Paul Planner. So we had a lot of really amazing contractors. They put in this year 4 weeks on the ground. We had our restoration experts, including Jess, if I didn't mention her. A lot of hours go into these projects. This was a big project. It's the second year. The first year was sort of a pilot. The second year has built up and putting a lot of time. And then these projects lend themselves perfectly to volunteer days. So if you're looking to engage with your public, beaver-based restoration work like this is super fun. Here's a picture of Allie doing a fantastic job explaining during a volunteer day what we're gonna be doing, and Allie's gonna talk more about these structures we were building. We had 4 volunteer days. We host them through one of our partners, High Country Conservation Advocates. We had well over 50. 50 seems so low. I feel like we had so many people there, and the energy is really palatable when you have these volunteer days. We kind of say that if you're not smiling and having fun out there, you're doing it wrong. Like, you should be having a lot of fun, because you go from maybe 2 or 3 inches, maybe 6 inches deep in a riffle, and by the time you're done building a structure, you can be thigh deep. And people get so excited because it's so instantaneous. It's within an hour or two, you're seeing results, you're getting wet, you're getting muddy. My little kids came out, so you can have little kids. We had lots of retirees, and then everything in between. So these projects lend themselves to just that community engagement piece, which really builds up the buy-in, which builds up the excitement. And then we had academic workshops. Western Colorado University is there in Gunnison, and so we can engage with our professors that are there, and their students came out. Allie did a lot of the work with those students, as well as Mark and Jess. And so those were really fun to have students both doing educational, but then also hopefully our future practitioners. They got to get out in the water and build some of these structures. Ideally, we're building up kind of that future workforce, because there's going to be a lynch point in this where we're going to need more contractors to actually implement this work as we go bigger and bigger. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Allie.
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Allie Gizzi, and I am a contractor who's been working on this project and projects like it for several years now, under the excellent guidance of people like Mark and Jess. And so now that we've kind of set the stage for why we're doing this work in the area that we're doing it in and how we did this work, I want to kind of set the stage of what this work actually ends up looking like when we conduct it. So you've heard a lot about low-tech process-based, beaver-based, all this kind of stuff. Let's talk about what it looks like on the ground. So I want to draw your attention to the 3 images that I have on this side of the screen. The top image is what Trail Creek looked like on arrival. So before we did any restoration work, this is what it looked like. And you might say, well, that's not that simple. You know, I noticed there's a couple different things happening there. That looks kind of messy. And the reason it looks kind of messy is because beaver used to be on site. That's actually a relic beaver dam. However, the system is starting to unravel. So it's starting to drain, the riparian vegetation is becoming stressed, and we're losing in-stream and out-of-stream habitat diversity. And so this middle image here is what the site looked like 2 weeks after we were on the ground. So we implemented for 2 weeks in 2021, and this is the immediate response that the system had. So this is low flow. We have not had a high flow event, and we have not had any beaver activity on the site in that middle picture. But just with your eyes, no numbers, you can probably tell that the system has changed. There's been an immediate response. The water's moving out into the valley bottom, and it's starting to resaturate and become more available for the riparian vegetation and create a large diversity of habitat in that system already. And now let's take a look at that bottom photo. And it's pretty obvious, again, what has happened. We have a far more robust riparian vegetation, and this is a full year after implementation. This is August of this year. And one thing that I don't know if you can quite tell, it kind of looks like our structures got bigger, and that has nothing to do with us. That's because we had beaver move into the site within a year after implementation, which is just basically the dream for a project like this. Now, how long will the beaver stay there? We don't know. That's going to take long-term monitoring to see that they can stay healthy in that system. But what you'll see is that this is August in the system. It's really green. And to be fair, the top image was from September. The bottom one's from August. So we do have a little bit of a temporal variation. But I think you can probably tell that that riparian vegetation is going to be healthier for longer than what you see on top. And these systems are complex. There's a lot of different benefits that these bring. I'm just pointing out a couple right here. And so there's some specs on the side of how many structures we put in, the miles of riverscape we worked on, but I kind of want to take you to what this looks like on the ground. So I'm just going to go through some images, and what you're going to see is a similar time lapse, but on the ground, where we have before we showed up, 2 weeks after, and then in August of the next year. And in some locations, you're going to be able to see where beaver actually came in on the site. So you might notice, you could probably walk across that, no problem. There, okay, your feet are probably going to get wet, and that's a year later. There you might notice that someone or something has built on top of our BDA. It's no longer a dam analog, it's now fully a beaver dam. Same here, you see some of that channel complexity that we talked about in our previous presentation. And you might notice that someone's put up a home there now. That was this year. And so this, I'm just going to preface this one. This is the section of Trail Creek that we worked on this year. So this is 2022 pre-restoration. And if this works, you're going to see it transition into after we worked on the site. So this is a section where we actually don't have beaver in there yet. But you might be able to tell that beaver were there, and we're taking advantage of that beaver infrastructure that's on site. So what I really want to point out is these areas where these massive pools showed up, we did not put a beaver dam analog across that entire system. You didn't need to. There's a relic structure there. So we just sort of chose the areas where that structure had failed, reinforced them, and should a beaver move in, they're going to reinforce it and take it to a whole nother level. Now, this is that same section that I had images up on site. So we were just looking right in here. Upstream of this is where we worked in 2021. Downstream was in 2022. And now it's wiggling, but you should get the vibe still. And so what I really want to leave you with and thinking about right now before we jump into discussion and Q&A is that our work was as successful as it was in this past year because beaver came on site. So the final goal of our restoration work here is to have healthy beaver populations cycling through. They don't need to be there 100% of the time, but within this larger landscape scale, we want healthy, thriving beaver populations moving in and out of these systems. And as you can see, this is the work we did. This is the work the beaver did. They're going to do more than us every single time. They're on site 24/7. They're working on their dams and canals not 24/7, they sleep. But, but it feels like they're working 24/7. And they actually continued to work on our structures while we were doing work downstream, which was pretty incredible to get to watch. So I guess I can turn it back over to Jess for entering into some Q&A.
All right, I didn't even have to ask for questions. Actually, I'm going to leave you guys this.
Oh, sure.
If you can't hear the questions, just go ahead.
If you are planning in a system that has a pretty low beaver recruitment potential because they're very far away, the populations that you know, or that could be dangerous when you get there, highways, bridges, that kind of thing, what is a typical maintenance schedule if you kind of know that, your potential is low to recruit them?
start with, or you want to start with?
If you're counting on doing most of the work and not having Beaver help, you know, I think it's going to, the structures that you build are going to be quite ephemeral, and it's going to depend totally on the flow regime and the conditions, but I would probably plan on going in most every year to check it, just to be, and this is a different kind of view of restoration, of not, you know, thinking of it as a project that you do and then you maintain. It's more of a stewardship thing, because now you're taking on the role of a population that no longer is able to, isn't there. So I would think of it more like stewardship and do it annually.
Annual maintenance, and it's not like, say, after 5 years we're finally stable, you know, willows have woven. Is there kind of a slower period where then you're like, oh, that's looking good, and all of a sudden you have this huge flood that tears everything else?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very episodic, I mean, typically. So I think the way to think about those things is just as a long-term stewardship project.
I see a lot of other hands, and I'm going to you next, Julie, but there was a part in that question that was about thinking about how beavers get to a site and that population connectivity piece, which I think you guys should address.
I think, is it okay if I talk about that?
Yeah.
That thing's scary. I mean, I think you got to think about that. That's actually a very key piece. Is whether are you mimicking, or are you like promoting and sustaining beavers? You can do. But what we tried to do with Trail Creek, and one of the reasons we chose it, is that we think that it's got high potential to be recolonized, and we think if we link up a whole bunch of those together, then we may be able to start stepping out of the picture a little bit more. And I think that's where a lot of the thought process has to go when you're doing beaver-based restoration, is in site selection and really prioritizing, really thinking about where you want to do this work. And one of the main things that should drive your selection of sites is how well connected it is to other beaver populations, and maybe prioritize those that you think you can link a bunch together and get more of a sustainable metapopulation.
Julie.
Before my question too, what about if you think beaver can't get there, what about bringing them in once you've got it ready for them?
I don't want to hog all the answers, but I'll let you. I like to say I think about this all the time, but I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing beavers in and moving them around. But I think there's a very high expectation for what you can accomplish with that. And from what we learned, you know, watching our friends in Washington do this, and on big scales, it's hard to move populations of that kind of an animal to a new place and get them to flourish. Now it happens, and there's like good anecdotal stories. I don't think it's a scalable solution, but I think it's a good one to use opportunistically when you can.
Okay, wait, so my actual question, sorry. Talk to us about terminology. So I've like been knocking myself out and beating up my team to not say BDA because of the word dam and the perceived conflict with water rights downstream. So Jess said something to me that completely calmed me down, so I was hoping you guys should share. Do you remember what you told me?
Calm them.
I want to let Ashley answer this too, because she, like, yeah, I do, because you deal in a world of a lot of regulation and different like decision makers. But my thought on that is, if people aren't ready to talk about beaver dams, they're probably not ready to have beavers on their site. So let's just get the elephant out of the room, and if it's not the right place for beavers to exist, then let's go find some place that is the right site.
Yeah, and from a Forest Service side, we haven't had that kind of issue. When we're working on our NEPA, which is our environmental compliance, we use BDA. When we apply for a core permit, we're using BDA. When we're in the paper, this project made the paper 3-4 times this past year, we use BDA. And I love that Jess just said, like, if you're not ready to talk about them as dams. Now, we definitely want to stay away from diversions and storage. It's all about augmentation, and it's all about beaver dams. So we do stay away from things like calling them a diversion, but we actually haven't had much issue where we are to call them BDAs. It's becoming just the common rancher knows what a BDA. My mom in Minnesota now knows what a BDA. Like BDA is becoming so common. We're seeing a lot of comfortable feelings around it where we are, at least in Gunnison County.
Could I speak real quick on that too? And I think learning that terminology that's appropriate to approach this work with is really important. So like Ashley said, the word diversion is one to stay away from, because frankly, we're not diverting the water, we're restoring the natural flow regime of these systems. With that in mind, when you're trying to choose systems that you want to work in, choose ones where you truly are, where that is the natural flow regime of the system. Don't try to like shove this puzzle piece in somewhere where it doesn't fit. So if this, if you're in an area where it was historically a beaver meadow, pre-European colonization, we're restoring natural flow regime. That's all it is. And so there's a lot of different tools for doing that. BDAs is one of the many tools that we have in our toolbox to do this kind of work. Just happens to be the most popular and most well-known.
Back to the previous question, but a different scenario. Like you've got healthy beaver populations upstream, downstream, but you're working in an incised system where there's not a lot of veg. So what's the approach there? Because it takes a while to get the ecosystem reestablished before the beavers could be a part of it. Or does it? I guess that's my question.
I'll toss this one to Mark in a second, but I think you almost answered your own question in the question, which is veg. Sometimes the order of operations here is get veg on the site and then do this type of work. But Mark probably has a more nuanced answer for you.
Yeah, I guess it would be, what's the timing on that experience? How long?
Well, there's the famous, we actually have one of these. I don't think it's worth trying to shuffle through slides to put the picture up, but the slides, the examples that a lot of people have in their minds is the use of BDAs and beavers as tools to like bring up the grade of a deeply incised creek, and Bridge Creek was like the quintessential example of that. And it's like, yeah, that's a thing. You can do that. That's, but that's a multi-year process. That's a year after year after year after year building sediment up. Is that what you're getting at? Kind of. And I think you need to think about these systems. So that's kind of the big long term of a really broken system, like Johannes was talking about. Hey, if it's really broken, it's probably going to take a lot to fix it. So that's either a long time frame or a lot of effort, or both, in a deeply incised stream system. Trail Creek happened to be one that's like, it's only incised that deep, and a beaver can build a dam that fast, to that height really quickly. The veg was all there, so it was only one piece was missing. And in some of these other systems, the engine that keeps this thing sustainable is that you got to have the veg, you got to have the water, and you got to have the beavers, basically. So if more than one of those things is missing, you've got more than one of those things to put back.
I'm curious because obviously, 2 years, it'll take a while for vegetation recruitment and everything patterns to happen, but in your time on the site, what are the typical species that beaver are eating on this location? Obviously, it's choosy generalist, sometimes it's unpredictable, but what do they tend to gravitate towards? And are you seeing sufficient recruitment or sufficient opportunity for those veg to come in to be able to sustain the population that's moved in?
Well, on Trail Creek in particular, the vegetation isn't really an issue. It's pretty lush, and it's incised to it. The incision's not so far that it's not the water table's still supporting willows and a lot of wetland vegetation. And the beavers, I don't know what they're eating most of the time, but it's almost all willows and wetland herbaceous species.
I'm going to pause there for just a second because that alarm means it's 10 o'clock, which is officially the end of the session. And I'm going to volunteer another 10 minutes of these guys' time. So if anybody wants to stay through the break, then please do that. But I also want to thank Johannes and Travis and these guys and say thank you all for coming to the session. But don't feel like you have to leave. Okay, next question.
I did want to go back to terminology for just a sec. Those of us who are not working in and around the choir,
you're gonna embrace this approach with people, you can't really do it without, getting comfortable with the fact. It's about kind of like, if you're doing process-based restoration, you got to be able to call out the processes that you're trying to restore. Like, at some point, you got to be honest. And I know you're not saying be dishonest, but I think a big part of the social aspect that we think is holding back this kind of restoration is really about that fear, and we're not going to get around the fear by just changing the terminology or like trying to dance around some words. I think.
Mark and I have already so we'll probably leave it there. But I just, for those of us that really do work with people, that's a huge red flag. I think there's creative ways around that you can still get really cool stuff done. But we'll agree to disagree a little bit on that.
Change it to their rules, right? Sometimes your way's gonna work, and sometimes
Exactly.
it does not work.
Well, I think you can focus in places where it is somewhat acceptable and let people become comfortable with it, rather than, trying to say, hey, we're gonna go do beaver restoration out over on your property, but we're not gonna tell you that there's gonna be beavers there. I think.
Is there a slope or material tolerance, like substrate tolerance for installing BEAs? So specifically, I'm working in a system that has a fairly steep slope, almost a 3% slope, coarse cobble substrate. There's beavers in the area, they're upstream, we just kind of want to promote them to come downstream. Be a great way to all these, functions for floodplain connectivity, trap sediment. But I guess I'm reserved because it is fairly steep in this reach, fairly coarse, and how hard is it going to be to actually get these posts driven down into the bed of the channel?
Well, that's just go drive a post in and see how it goes. It's not a very facetious thing.
Big cobbles, freaking coarse, and you just move it. You're like, nope, not there.
There's very practical limitations to what you can do with posts. I mean, you could consider postless things, but what you really have to consider is in a steep system, the things you build are probably going to be very ephemeral. And so, maybe one approach is to spend a lot less money on them, build more of them, and just know they're going to wash out a lot.
Was this part of the grazing allotment in that area, and this permit keeping cattle out?
Yeah, every third year, there's cattle in there for up to 60 days. And they have a cattle pool allotment. And as Mark had mentioned, the vegetation didn't seem like a limitation here. But we did work with the cattle allotment, and they've been a pretty big fan of this work. They stopped us last year. We've had some good conversations with them. Meaning they stopped by the project and said they're seeing more grass for their cattle, which is pretty neat. And they actually have picked 3 more locations they'd like us to go do this work for their cattle. So fortunately, our grazing allotments have been compatible with this work in the site. And they recognized it. When we met with them last year, they already knew all about beavers and what they could do for the landscape. They were already kind of on board with this kind of work, which was nice. There's so many. Do you want me to call on people? How about someone over there? Was there some? Yeah?
I'm curious about population controls. Like, once you have a population of beavers within an area, it's still, we put up the point mark that we had 5% to carrying capacity, what it historically was, right? So how do we keep people from over-harvesting once again within that area? Is that a conversation? Is it regulations?
Oh, that's the $64,000 question right there. And it needs to be, I think you need to analyze it on a meta-population basis, on a big scale. We don't know why they can't. It would seem such an industrious animal that's so well known for creating wetland habitat, right? Now that we're done making hats out of them. We're done shipping them across the sea. And we have been for almost 200 years. Why aren't they coming back all over the place? Oops. Places, I don't think it's necessarily over harvest. I think what's probably going on is populations are so spotty and they're so slow in reproducing and spreading that they just are, almost all of the complexes that we see mapped out on the landscapes are a small number of individuals, and they're very vulnerable to all kinds of things like diseases and predation, and maybe a random like trapper, or maybe they get into trouble and start clogging a culvert and they. So I think it's a very complex, actually, equation of why the populations aren't expanding, and I honestly think the best thing we could do in places where it's possible is to just keep trying to make their habitat as good as we can, and hope that they can expand and reach some levels where they become more sustainable.
I'd like to add something to that too, where, so part of the dialogue we have around this work and around beaver populations often focuses on that, kind of fur rush where people were out there harvesting them largely for hat and fur trade. And what sometimes gets missed is that the assault on beaver continued up until like currently, but even in the past 50 years, it was very in vogue to fully dynamite beavers out. Like light dynamite and put it on a dam and explode it. And I feel as though that's something we need to start having in our dialogue as well of, okay, well, part of the reason they haven't come back is because this didn't end when the fur trade ended. And that had to do with that generational amnesia of what streams really looked like. So there's a lot of layers here of what is going on with that.
And I think one of the really big things about this project was also working with our counties and with the Forest Service, because we have so many roads in this area. How do we both invite beavers to come back into this area, but also coexist with them? So we did a lot of preventative work around culverts and roads, and worked with our county very regularly to do projects so that as beavers come back, and to Allie's point, they still were parking excavators at 2 or 3 sites in Taylor all summer long just to rip out these couple of beaver dams that were just a problem every single year. So one, we can make it more economic for them not to have to park their excavator there all summer to rip out a beaver dam, but also allow the beaver now to build up a population near roads, because I think that's a missed opportunity that we have, where we're not allowing these populations to exist near roads because we're constantly ripping out their dams. They lose the habitat, they get predated on or diseased or trapped near those roads. And so working with your counties, we've also worked with the local trappers and working with them. And so there's just a lot of different ways that we can kind of mitigate and invite more beavers and then coexist well.
How much has as far as the recovery of the beavers since the fur trade, how much has, in your opinion, has the fencing of grazing lands contributed to them not being able to move back into the destruction of streamside habitat?
I mean, in Taylor Park, I don't think the grazing is affecting the beaver populations.
Private lands where
Private.
I'm not sure that the fencing is as much of the issue as the perceived conflict of having beaver on grazing land. I don't want to overstep on this, but I don't know if the cattle fencing is wildly effective at keeping beaver out, especially the way a lot of it is constructed. There's plenty of space for beaver to move in and around and get under that fencing. But if, as a landowner, you don't find beaver to be tolerable, then landowners will consistently remove beaver. And I understand their reasoning. But there's a little bit of difference that can happen. So I don't know that fencing is the thing that's causing issue.
I'm not sure I got my question.
Okay.
It's not fencing keeping the beavers out, it's the fencing keeping the cattle in, and the damage the cattle do to the stream bank, destruction of the willows, trampling the stream bank down, becoming part of surface. This obviously isn't a case in the Forest Service property.
I'm going to jump in on this one, and I'm going to give you a quick answer, and I think you're right on target. The degradation of riparian vegetation plays a huge role. If there's not woody species there, beavers aren't going to live there, and it's kind of that simple. So, thank you all for saying. Thank you for your enthusiasm and participation, and thank you guys for being awesome.